I had just turned 28 when I proposed to my girlfriend of 3 years, who was 26 at the time. It happened a few months ago, and up until that point, I believed we had a balanced, peaceful relationship. She had always been fairly laid back and seemed to appreciate my opinions on most matters. Yet, as soon as the ring slipped onto her finger, it felt as though her entire demeanor shifted. She became quite controlling and extremely stubborn, to the point where she wanted everything her way without any room for negotiation. I tried explaining that I also had thoughts about how I envisioned our wedding, but she simply brushed off my words. She planned every single aspect by herself, down to the smallest detail, and insisted on inviting whomever she pleased. She even tracked down some of my very old acquaintances, people I hadn't spoken to in forever, and insisted they be there, convinced that absolutely everyone who had ever known me should be on the guest list. I attempted to argue that having these people there would be incredibly awkward, but she wouldn't budge. Eventually, I gave up trying to rein in her decisions, and I just held out hope that the side of her I once knew would return once the wedding was over. I knew she had control issues. My close friend, who was the one who set us up, had hinted at that in the past, but I never imagined the problem ran so deep. She had to call every shot, and if someone dared oppose her, she would spiral into this intense meltdown. Because I truly cared for her, I endured her behavior for those weeks leading up to the wedding. But then, she crossed a line so significant it shattered any illusions I still held. A few months earlier, as we were compiling our guest list together, she asked me out of the blue about my sister. That in itself was surprising, because I had already made it crystal clear early on in our relationship that my sister and I hadn't spoken for 10 years. I had gone no contact with her, and I intended to keep it that way forever. My fiancée had met my parents for the first time around 6 months into our relationship. While at my parents' place, she noticed all these family pictures showcasing me as a kid, alongside someone who looked exactly like me. Naturally, she asked who this identical girl was. With no small measure of reluctance, I told her that was my twin sister, someone from whom I had been estranged for a decade. My fiancé knew very well that the two of us had a bad history and that I never wanted to see my sister again. Yet, apparently, she decided that my preference wasn't worth respecting. My twin sister, who is the same age as me, and I were not close while growing up. Yes, we had those smiling, cheerful family portraits on the wall, showing us hugging and laughing as if we were best friends. However, beneath that facade, we were the very opposite. We resented each other deeply and were always looking for new ways to outdo one another. Our rivalry wasn't innocent or playful, it was laced with real animosity that only grew stronger as we aged. Things reached a breaking point in high school when I scored higher than her on our standardized tests. Her fury was so palpable that she avoided making eye contact with me for days. Although that bothered me at the time, I also felt like I'd finally won for once. Little did I realize that our most destructive drama still lay ahead. Within a few weeks, the college acceptance letters arrived. We both had strong GPAs, straight A's, so we assumed we'd be accepted pretty much everywhere we applied. My dream was to attend Yale, while my sister had her heart set on Princeton. I never originally planned to apply to Princeton because I assumed she would be there, and the last thing I wanted was to end up sharing a campus with her. But at the last minute, my friends convinced me that refusing to apply because of my sister was not a sound reason to limit my future, and that maybe it was time to let this ridiculous competition go. After some internal debate, I did apply. But I kept quiet about it because, after publicly announcing I'd never apply to Princeton, and taunting her about my decision, I would have felt foolish if she discovered I had changed my mind. As far as I knew, she also hadn't applied to Yale, presumably because she wanted to steer clear of me too, or maybe as a spiteful retort to my behavior. Eventually, my acceptance letters started rolling in, and sure enough, I got into both Yale and Princeton. My sister was accepted to Columbia but not to Princeton. Given how determined and vocal she had been about wanting Princeton, I knew that finding out she'd been rejected would crush her. I was also aware that when she learned I had been admitted, it would be like pouring salt on her wounds. Realizing the tension this could create, I intended to keep my Princeton admission to myself. I wasn't planning on attending there anyway, so it felt unnecessary to stir the pot by letting her know. Unfortunately, my parents discovered it somehow, possibly by going through the mail. Believing they were doing something celebratory and wholesome, they threw a surprise party that same afternoon, complete with 2 separate cakes for me and my sister, each adorned with the names of the colleges to which we'd been accepted. I had no idea about my parents' grand plan. If I had, perhaps I would have stopped it. As soon as my sister noticed the word Princeton on my cake, she looked at me in shock and immediately accused me of lying about not applying. She quickly realized from the guilty expression on my face that it was true. In a heartbeat, she erupted in this hysterical outburst, screaming that I was the reason her life was ruined and that I had stolen her dreams. She refused to even let me explain or mention that I wasn't going to attend Princeton anyway. Of course, given our long-standing hostility, it was impossible for her to believe I didn't intend harm. She was convinced my entire purpose had been to sabotage her. After an extended meltdown, she stormed out of the house in tears, her voice hoarse from all that yelling. I remained in the living room, feeling paralyzed, while my parents expressed how tired they were of our constant fights. This wasn't the first time we had put them through endless conflict. They told me in no uncertain terms that both my sister and I needed to mature, and I couldn't blame them. They had tried so hard for years to get us to get along, but everything they did seemed futile. Eventually, they gave up when we entered high school, especially as it became clear we would never reconcile while we were under the same roof. Later that day, though, I decided to at least attempt to take their advice. I didn't want us to keep living like sworn enemies. About 15 minutes after she disappeared, I went outside, determined to track her down and at least talk calmly. Most of the guests had already left, disturbed by what they had witnessed, and the sky had grown dark. It took me a moment to adjust to the low light, so I called out her name but didn't see her anywhere. What I do remember is that before I could even register what was going on, something hard struck the back of my skull with a force that made me collapse immediately. All I could feel was excruciating pain. I screamed for help, but the agony was so overpowering that I soon lost consciousness. The next thing I knew, I was in a hospital room with a bandage around my wrist. My parents explained to me that my sister had been waiting outside with a shovel of all things. The second she heard me call her name, she swung it at me from behind. After that, she stomped on my left wrist so violently that it was dislocated. Even though our competitiveness was intense, I never in a million years imagined she could do anything that depraved to me or to anyone else. My parents pleaded for me not to press charges against my own sibling, so I reluctantly yielded to their request. But as soon as I was discharged from the hospital, I cut off all contact with her and never asked about her again. I still have no idea which university she attended or where she ultimately ended up, because as far as I was concerned, she wasn't part of my life anymore. My parents continued their relationship with her in some capacity. There were occasional weekends where they left without telling me their destination. I had no doubt they went to see my sister, but I never held that against them. They were stuck in a horrible position, and it made sense that they would want to see both of their children, just not together under the same roof. I understood they had no choice but to keep us apart. After the doctors cleared me to resume normal life, I started my freshman year of college, but the whole ordeal had taken such a toll that my grades slipped that semester. On top of that, I began experiencing frequent migraines, presumably side effects of the head injury, and the lump at the back of my skull remained for quite some time, an everlasting reminder of my sister's violent behavior. That year was a blur of emotional turmoil, and I had to go to therapy for a while to recover some sense of normalcy. 10 years have passed since then. These days, I've fully moved on with my life, or so I thought. My parents and I never discuss my sister, and the rest of our family knows better than to bring her up around me. I figure everyone still secretly keeps in touch with her, but no one breathes a word about it in my presence. As for my fiancée, I assumed she understood that any mention of my twin was a massive red flag. So when she initially brought her up during wedding planning, I immediately said, no, absolutely not, and left it at that. I didn't go into detail regarding the specifics of what my sister had done, because I didn't want to relive that trauma, nor did I believe I owed anyone a blow-by-blow account. I thought the fact that I deliberately avoided my sister for a decade was self-explanatory. If that wasn't enough evidence of how badly things had gone, I didn't know what would be. Rather than leaving well enough alone, my fiancée just wouldn't stop pestering me. I threatened that if she kept pushing about my sister's invitation, would cancel the wedding altogether. Finally, she dropped the subject. Or so I believed. Fast forward to 2 days ago, the actual wedding day. We were at the ceremony venue, and I was standing next to the minister, bracing myself for the big moment. The bridal music began, and the bridesmaids started to walk down the aisle. Suddenly, I noticed a face that sent a cold wave of shock through me. My twin sister was there, arm in arm with one of my close friends, who seemed equally baffled. She looked just as disoriented as I felt, and it was as if time styling brightly, apparently oblivious to my reaction. Wasting no time, I demanded to know how my sister ended up here after I had so adamantly insisted she not be invited. My fiancé tried to wave me off, asking that we discuss it after we exchanged vows, as if the specifics didn't matter at that moment. But there was no way I was proceeding with the ceremony under these conditions. I asked her again, more forcefully, and that's when she confessed that she had lied to my parents, claiming I wanted to reconcile with my sister before tying the knot. That was how she'd managed to convince them to give her my sister's address and phone number. She went on to brag, as if she'd done me some grand favor, about how much effort she put into persuading my parents. She even said it was about time my sister and I made peace with the past, all without having any clue of the horrors that actually went down. We stood there, in front of everyone, bickering back and forth for a full 5 minutes while our guests just stared in shock. Eventually, it dawned on me that our relationship had reached the end of the line. I felt betrayed on such a fundamental level that I couldn't imagine moving forward with this woman. So I turned around and walked straight out of my own wedding. I heard her calling out my name, pleading with me not to leave. But I was beyond caring. I stormed into my car and drove off. I drove for hours until nightfall, feeling my phone buzzing incessantly with calls and texts from my fiancé and my family, all of which I willfully ignored. By the time I stopped for the night, there were no decent hotels around, so I just spent the night in my car. Later that evening, I used my phone to cancel various wedding-related arrangements. I refused to answer anyone's messages or calls. I was emotionally drained and honestly livid. The following day, I had just enough fuel to head back home. But the second I saw my fiancé's car parked in the driveway, I knew I couldn't face her or that house, so I drove to a hotel instead. 2 days passed with me holed up there, steadfastly avoiding any attempts at contact from both my parents and my fiancé. I couldn't fathom how they bought such a ridiculous story, that I wanted to repair my relationship with someone who had almost shattered my skull. At the very least, my parents could have checked with me first instead of believing my fiancé's words at face value. The most overwhelming sense of betrayal was directed at my fiancé. She knew how important it was for me to keep my sister out of my life, yet she took it upon herself to disregard that boundary. Just a few hours ago, she sent me a text that was extraordinarily long, loaded with apologies and reasons for what she did. She claimed that once my parents explained the details of my falling out with my sister, after I stormed out of the ceremony, she finally understood why she had made such a disastrous decision. She took responsibility for springing such a horrible surprise on me, admitting she should have listened to my repeated warnings. However, she also slipped in a statement implying that if I had only shared the entire story with her, she wouldn't have gone against my wishes. I found that reasoning flawed. While, yes, it might have clarified just how serious the situation was, I still believe she should have trusted my judgment. Nobody ends a relationship with their own sibling for an entire decade without a very substantial reason. She should have respected my stance rather than feeling entitled to override it. Maybe someday I would have found the emotional energy to tell her the gruesome truth, but until then, my no should have been final. At this point, I'm completely done with this relationship. I no longer see myself walking down the aisle with someone who could betray my trust so casually. That said, some people wonder if I should apologize for not disclosing the whole story about my twin from the start. Personally, I don't feel any sense of guilt. I didn't want to revisit that pain, and I shouldn't have to. She had no business inviting someone I've actively avoided for a third of my life. If anyone owes apologies here, it's her. I feel zero obligation to say sorry, because she's the one who orchestrated this entire fiasco behind my back. An initial update: it's been 3 days since my non-wedding, and I'm still staying at a hotel. I posted my dilemma online to see if I was in the wrong for not explaining the entire backstory to my fiancé sooner. The feedback pretty much confirmed what I suspected. I had every right to maintain my privacy and keep that chapter of my life locked away. I have, therefore, continued to ignore her attempts to communicate with me. I did, however, speak briefly with my mom this morning. It was an awkward conversation. She apologized for not realizing sooner how upset I would be about my sister's presence. She said my fiancé had started reaching out to them weeks before the wedding, slowly winning them over to the idea of me reconciling with my sister for the big day. She admitted that they let themselves be persuaded into keeping the entire thing a secret from me because my fiancé framed it as a loving surprise. In retrospect, they clearly felt that was a gigantic mistake. I'm still struggling to decide how or when to forgive my parents. At some point, I likely will, because they at least seem honestly remorseful. But right now, the wound is too raw. I do plan on returning home in a few days, and I'll make sure my fiancée is not there. Since the house belongs to me, she'll have to move out, which I think is more charitable than she deserves. Either way, I'm certain this relationship is finished, and in a weird way, that realization brings relief. Another update, I told my fiancée, well, ex-fiancée, that she needed to gather her belongings and leave my property within 5 days. That was the time frame I gave her. On the 6th day, I went to the house, assuming she would be gone since she'd texted me, albeit tersely, that she would be out by then. However, as soon as I walked into my living room, she was standing there, waiting. Apparently, she had hidden her car somewhere down the street, leading me to believe I could peacefully enter my own home. I felt intense irritation and asked her flat out to leave because I had no interest in rehashing what happened. True to her personality, she ignored my words and launched into a monologue about how she was worried sick for days and that I should have told her where I was staying. Incredibly, she seemed to believe we could just pick up where we left off, as if life were a DVD she could pause and unpause at will. When I didn't respond, she shifted tactics and started blaming me for keeping her in the dark about the full details regarding my sister. She claimed I'd put her in potential danger by not revealing how unhinged my sibling could be, especially since she went out of her way to meet my sister alone. That's when I lost every shred of patience. I roared at her to get the hell out immediately and told her it was over once and for all. She looked shaken, probably because she assumed I was just venting and that her tears or words would eventually change my mind. She began crying in front of me, but I was too mentally exhausted to muster any sympathy. I just repeated that she needed to leave right then because I couldn't even stand the sound of her voice anymore. I must have hit a nerve because she burst into full-on sobs, but I felt numb to it. I went to my bedroom and locked the door behind me so I could rest, ignoring her weeping. When I woke up, it was already night, and she was finally gone. At some point, I imagine she'll come back for the rest of her possessions, but I'm relieved that she's not here right now. A third update, 3 days have elapsed since she left, although she's still calling my phone non-stop. I haven't picked up even once, but I do have some residual pity for her, though I'm not planning on acting on it in any way. My parents came by recently, apologizing profusely for their part in the fiasco and saying they shoulders all the blame for enabling it. At this point, I was finally curious enough to ask how my sister's life had panned out since the day she bashed my head. They told me that after everything went down, they realized just how severe her anger problems were. They sent her to a long-term rehabilitation center to address her violent tendencies. After several months of intense therapy, she was declared stable enough to attend college. She got her own apartment off campus, and my parents supported her with frequent weekend visits. Eventually, she found a job not too long after I did, and for the past 7 years, she's been living out of town, running a modest but successful business. My parents also shared that when I walked out of the wedding, my sister seemed to realize she was the catalyst for this disaster, even though she was originally told by my fiancé that it was just a rehearsal, not the real ceremony. It made sense why she looked so confused. She apologized to my parents before leaving, clearly ashamed of having shown up. They then handed me a handwritten letter from her. After they left, I read it alone, and I found myself fighting back tears. She wrote that she truly regretted everything, our childhood rivalry and especially what happened that night. She lamented that we could have been best friends but ended up mortal enemies instead. Though she doubted we could patch things up anytime soon, she hoped that one day, I'd be willing to forgive her. She confessed she has harbored the dream that perhaps, if we both could heal, we might finally be the kind of siblings other people assume we were in those smiling childhood photos. I'll admit, the letter hit me hard. A small part of me does yearn for that sibling bond, but the scars are deep. Maybe when more time passes, and when I manage to settle my own emotional wounds, I'll consider reaching out to her. After all, I wasn't blameless in our younger years, either. For now, though, I have enough on my plate, my broken engagement, and the betrayal I've just endured. My main focus is putting all this drama behind me and prioritizing my mental health, which has taken a severe beating from these recent events. The only thing left is for my ex-fiancée to come for her things so I can permanently cut ties, block her number, and move on. I've had more turmoil in these past weeks than most people deal with in years, and I'm completely done with living on the edge of constant chaos. My future starts the moment I turn that final page, and I'm more than ready to turn it.